South China Morning Post, 16th of February 2024. Regarding Indonesia-China relations, will the incoming president of Indonesia, Prabowo, challenge Beijing or preserve the economic agreements established by Widodo? China has engaged in the intimidation of Indonesia and the seizure of Indonesian assets. Based on unofficial quick count results indicating that Indonesia Defense Minister Prabowo Subianto is likely to win the presidential election on Wednesday, many are concerned about the former general's ability to steer the nation's foreign policy, especially regarding China. While confident analysts speculate that Prabowo, given his military background and previous nationalistic rhetoric, might adopt a more resolute position towards Beijing, others contend that he will likely stick to the pragmatic strategy employed by departing President Joko Widodo, which has heavily relied on Chinese investment to fund the nation's accelerated infrastructure development in the past decade. Tom Pepinski, a professor and director of the Southeast Asia program at Cornell University, remarked that the question of how Prabowo would balance the interests of the United States and China was intriguing. Still, he predicted Jakarta's foreign policy outlook would remain non-aligned. Prabowo made this commitment while elaborating on his foreign policy during his campaign. In November, Prabowo informed the audience at the think tank Center for Strategic and International Studies in Jakarta that Indonesia would maintain our independent foreign policy and cordial relations with its neighbors while refusing to join any military or geopolitical bloc. The director of the International Relations Department at Gadjah Mada University in Yogyakarta, Nur Rahmat Yuliantoro, stated that Prabowo could exploit Indonesia's non-aligned status to advance the competing interests of both superpowers in the nation. Nua stated, he views China as a major actor capable of serving as an adequate counterbalance to the strength of another major actor, the United States. Indonesia is anticipated to maintain an intermediate stance to optimize the advantages existing security guarantees offer. Money is essential in China, money is running out in China. Indonesia, which possesses the largest nickel reserves globally, implemented a prohibition on nickel ore exports in 2020 to establish a competitive supply chain for electric vehicles and batteries. China has been an active investor in Indonesia's nickel sector, allocating $3.6 billion for the initial half of 2022. Under the leadership of Widodo, Chinese investment has also been crucial to Indonesia's infrastructure drive, particularly in projects such as Jakarta's October launch of Southeast Asia's first high-speed rail. Multiple analysts have expressed skepticism regarding Prabowo's ability to disrupt the long-standing economic partnership between Indonesia and China, which Widodo established, especially regarding Beijing's Belt and Road Initiative. China is Indonesia's most significant investment and trade partner. New forecasted that Prabowo would uphold the policies established by Widodo and maintain strong diplomatic relations with Beijing, particularly about infrastructure development and investment. He contended that the bilateral ties between Indonesia and China established during Widodo's administration were too valuable to be significantly altered and that doing so would only result in Indonesia suffering losses. Chinese Premier Li Chang pledged an additional $21.7 billion in high-interest Chinese debt investment for Indonesia during a September visit to Jakarta. This was in addition to the $44.89 billion commitment made by Premier Widodo during his July meeting with Chinese President Xi Jinping. Pepinski speculated that, shortly, the situation would remain relatively stable due to the lack of motivation for change and the continued popularity of Jokowi, the famous moniker of Widodo. Thus, Prabowo's policy will be to continue moving forward in this manner without difficulty. However, Pepinski also stated that debt concerns rendered it improbable that the former general would be able to reconcile with China to secure additional funding for infrastructure. I believe he is cognizant of the plight of nations such as Kenya, Sri Lanka, Pakistan, and Maldives that have become reliant on Chinese investments and whose debts China refuses to renegotiate. Last month, during a presidential debate, Prabowo stated that Indonesia was in an advantageous position to service its foreign debts at a rate that would deter other nations from attempting to undermine its sovereignty. At approximately 40%, our foreign debt to gross domestic product ratio is currently among the lowest in the world, he explained. By implementing judicious and effective management practices, as well as aligning our economic strategy with downstream, we can presently fortify our negotiating position. I am not overly concerned about the desire of other nations to intervene alongside us. We maintain impeccable credit and never default on our obligations. A robust defense force is imperative to prevent any form of intervention. The central bank reported that Indonesia's foreign debt for the third quarter of 2023 amounted to $393.7 billion, or 28.9% of the country's gross domestic product. However, Chinese investments in specific regions of Indonesia have also come under intense scrutiny due to environmental impacts, worker safety concerns, and the large number of Chinese workers employed in these projects, as in the case of nickel smelters operated by China, which have been the subject of numerous accidents and fatalities in recent years. For instance, Ahmad Rizki Umar, a lecturer at the University of Queensland's School of Political Science and International Studies in Australia, stated that to diversify the country's portfolio, Prabowo's economic team looked for other sources of investment. He noted, nonetheless, that Chinese investment would likely continue to be substantial so long as it remained robust. The dispute that exists between China and Indonesia. Prabowo will undoubtedly encounter a challenge in the South China Sea, an area that Beijing asserts it owns in its nearly entirety. Nevertheless, Prabowo, in his capacity as defense minister, has exhibited a preference for employing diplomatic methods to resolve the territorial disputes between China and members of ASEAN in the waters abundant in resources. Prabowo stated that dialogue and consultations founded on mutual trust could resolve all disputes in the contested waterway in a statement issued after a defense ministers' meeting between ASEAN and China in 2021. He further advocated for the continuation of negotiations concerning a code of conduct for the South China Sea, which would establish territorial claims and rights for all involved parties. An equitable and mutually beneficial partnership, which is urgently required to establish global peace and stability, will be strengthened if the South China Sea is effectively managed, he said in the statement. In January, however, during a presidential debate on the South China Sea, Prabowo emphasized that Indonesia required a maritime defense capability upgrade to defend itself in the North Natuna Sea. China has asserted fishing rights within the waters where portions of its unilaterally claimed 9-line intersects with Indonesia's exclusive economic zone near the Natuna Islands. This has historically resulted in several confrontations. Prabowo's reference to bolstering maritime defenses implies that he might adopt a more resolute stance in safeguarding Indonesia's sovereignty in that particular naval region. Cornels Pepinski stated, "I don't see Prabowo inciting a fight, but it will be intriguing to see what transpires if another incident occurs, in the Natunas, which is virtually certain to transpire." Additionally, Prabowo's campaign manifesto characterizes the South China Sea as a strategic dilemma for Jakarta, advocating for anticipating potential conflicts between the United States and China concerning this contested waterway to mitigate potential risks to Indonesia. This mitigation could potentially be achieved through additional diplomatic efforts. Pepinski hypothesized that Prabowo might attempt to play a more conciliatory role if China presented strategic challenges to Indonesia's Southeast Asian neighbors in the South China Sea. He will be eager to establish himself as an individual capable of engaging in a conversation with Xi Jinping or any other Chinese leader of the state, he predicted. Umar of the University of Queensland stated that about foreign policy as a whole, Prabowo would prefer to play a more proactive role abroad than his predecessor. For instance, during a security dialogue in Singapore in June, Prabowo proposed a peace resolution for the Ukraine conflict without consulting Widodo. This was an instance of him deviating from the script. Ukraine labeled a Russian plan Prabowo's proposal, which included a referendum on disputed territories. Umar further contended that Prabowo aspired to fortify ties with the United States on matters of defense, particularly about the South China Sea. Like numerous Indonesian generals, Prabowo acquired substantial practical knowledge in Western countries during his military training. A portion of his education was completed in Germany and Fort Bragg, which is now known as Fort Liberty, United States. This demonstrated Indonesia's decades-long defense relations with the United States, an alliance that China would not soon be able to replicate. Umar stated, Prabowo will maintain equilibrium in the escalating rivalry between the United States and China, through the strengthening of ties with the United States in the defense sector, particularly with regard to the modernization of Indonesia's defense equipment. As a politician and defense minister, the former general has frequently emphasized the necessity of bolstering Indonesia's military might to transform it into a formidable nation capable of defending its interests. The extent to which the priorities he establishes during his tenure in office coincide with or contradict those of China is yet to be determined.